everybody. This video is going to go over Chapter 8, writing about symbolism, or imagery and symbolism. So, we're going to first talk about what each of those things are. What is imagery? What is symbolism? And then we're going to look at how those two things show up in our two short stories, The Story of an Hour and Hills Like White Elephants. So, first thing, images, imagery. They are words or phrases that appeal to our senses. They often put a picture in our head or touch on some sort of shared experience, like how something smells or how something sounds. So it's not just visual, right? But the visual imagery is definitely the most obvious, the one I think that people recognize a little quicker, you know. And it is, it puts an image in our head. So future days strung together like pearls in a rosary. That they're using imagery to help us envision something. Poetry is just chock full of imagery, but short stories are too, often. And we get the visual imagery, we get auditory imagery, so images of sound, you know, the loud iron clanking of the lift machinery. We have a connection with how things sound. It can help us feel like we're there. It helps us understand the story better, what the characters are experiencing better. There's gustatory imagery, which is having to do with taste. The example here is the acrid metallic taste of gunfire. It's a pretty cool phrase. There's kinetic imagery, which is imagery of motion. Bumping like a helium balloon at the ceiling of the brain. So they're using that image, that movement of a helium balloon bouncing on a regular ceiling, but they're placing it inside our brain, right? So it's bouncing off the ceiling of our brain. So helping us understand what they're trying to describe by using a kinetic image that we are already familiar with, so that it helps deepen the connection and helps us understand what the author is trying to convey even better. Thermal imagery, so temperature, the blue-black cold of early morning. Blue-black cold of early morning. It's a really interesting way to emphasize exactly what kind of cold he's talking about. There's tactile imagery, which is the image of feeling, touching something. So the ache of marriage throbs in the teeth, right? So taking that familiar feeling of a toothache, right, throbs in the teeth, and so that we understand exactly what they're trying to say about the ache of marriage. Doesn't sound so great, but we understand it. So imagery can be in many different forms. It does not have to just be visual imagery like we're probably used to. It's probably what we're most familiar with. But don't forget about all those other different types of images that an author can incorporate into the story as well. Right? All of that imagery, all of those different types of images, they help enrich our pleasure in reading. It helps us envision what's happening better. It helps us make connections so that we are better able to understand the action as well as what the characters are experiencing. But if repeated, right, they can become motifs. And that's going to be a pattern of imagery that then highlights an element of the story. So imagery in general simply helps us understand the story itself, the characters, what they're going through, right? But if that imagery is repeated and becomes a motif, then it starts pointing towards something under the surface, something bigger about the story, right? So that's why it's important to pay attention to them and to pay attention to whether or not they're repeated. That brings us to symbols. What are symbols? So if a repeated image gathers significant meaning and then seems to represent something more than itself, then the image has become a symbol, right? There are a lot of common symbols in our daily lives, right? Colors can often represent something. They're symbols of something else. A really easy one is the color white. It often symbolizes innocence and purity. You know, we often see angels in white. Brides wear white on their wedding day. Babies wear, often, you know, if you're of a certain religion, like their christening gowns will be white or a shade of white. But white definitely means something other than its true definition, if it's in a certain context. The color black, mystery, death, red, passion, anger. Yellow probably would represent more of like happiness, joy, friendship. Now, why these colors are symbols for those things, that's too much to get into, and I'm not sure we could ever really come up with a definite answer. But throughout history and cultures, you know, continuing to use these colors to represent different things, they have become symbols. And a lot of them are pretty widely recognized. Here in America, the eagle equals freedom. It is a symbol of freedom, a symbol of patriotism, perhaps. The owl is a symbol for wisdom. So, especially like if you think of children's stories, anytime there's an owl character, the owl is probably the smartest character in the book. They're just wise. That's what they symbolize to us. A dove symbolizes peace, right? So if there's a dove mentioned, pay attention to it. A snake symbolizes evil. Springtime, you know, symbolizes new beginnings and birth. If you think about, you know, springtime coming out of the harsh, cold winter, and we see, you know, the crocus coming up through the snow. We see the buds starting on the trees, and the flowers are starting to grow, and then they bloom, right? It's a season of growth, but the new growth, right? So springtime has come to symbolize new beginnings and birth, even if we're not really talking about plants, right? Winter is the almost like the end of our life, the end stage. If springtime is birth and new beginnings, winter is the exact opposite. So we start in springtime, summer, fall, winter. Each season and what happens in each season have become symbols for what happens. And those seasons are often used as symbols in literature. Right? Okay. So we also have what we call archetypal symbols, and I already mentioned the colors as an example, but what we're talking about with archetypal symbols are the universal symbols. They seem to convey a similar meaning across time and cultures. So one example is like the circle. You know, it represents wholeness and perfection. It symbolizes those concepts, and that's true across time and culture. It's not just something that Americans feel is a symbol. It's everywhere. The sea, the ocean, symbolizes a voyage through life. That's an archetypal symbol that's true across cultures as well. Uh, the hero archetype. That's an archetype that is cross-cultural as well. The villain archetype, right? The anti-hero. All those different types of characters. And if you want, you know, uh, more relatable version or example, Star Wars. uh, Star Wars has quite a few archetypal characters, but certainly you can find them in all kinds of literature, all kinds of TV and movies, across cultures. It's not just relegated to one area of the world. They're everywhere. Um, we also have on the next slide phallic and yonic symbols, and these are the symbols that are associated with human sexuality, and they're actually very commonly used. Sometimes comically, sometimes in a cheeky way, and sometimes in a very serious way. So we've got the phallic symbol, which stands for the male. And we're really, if you think of a phallic symbol, we're talking about, male genitalia and the shape of that. So we've got things like guns, stone, pillars, sticks, swords, knives, lollipops, bananas, cigars. There's a certain shape that they all have in common. And some of those phallic images have a certain association with them that they're used with force. They're powerful, right? Like a gun, a sword, a knife, right? Others are really more, again, cheeky, like the lollipop and the banana. But they are phallic symbols nonetheless. Whether it's to, indicate strength and potency and force and domination, or something a little more flirty and sexual, but they're all phallic symbols. And they are everywhere in literature, in media, in architecture. This phallic symbol is everywhere. There's also the yonic symbol, and a lot of people don't even realize that there is such a thing. Even people who know what a phallic image is, they do not know that there is a female counterpart. And if they've ever thought about it, they probably don't know that there's an actual term for it, but it's yonic. And the yonic symbols suggest fertility and the allure of female sexuality. And so we've got the image of a cave or a pot, like a cooking pot. Even rooms, because they're like vessels. Or roses in full bloom, cups and goblets, tunnels, right? And if you've probably seen this in maybe like an older movie or a cartoon even, where they want to imply that two characters are having sex, but for whatever reason they can't actually show it. You'll see the two characters, getting intimate, but before the deed actually happens, there'll be a cutscene, and suddenly it'll be like this black and white cartoon of a train going through a tunnel. And that's the phallic symbol and the yonic symbol coming together. So if you've ever wondered why they do that, that's why. But all of these images are pretty common throughout literature and life in general. But in order to truly be a symbol in what what you're looking at in the moment, in this case a particular story, in order for it to truly be a symbol, it has to be significant. It has to reveal something. Sometimes, as Freud said, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. And I added this, sometimes a cup is just a cup, or a rose is just a rose. You know, they don't always have to symbolize all of those things I just talked about. And sometimes they're not symbols at all. It's if they are significant and reveal something about the story.